Hello and welcome to the Klassiki Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your window into the world of Eastern European film. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary titles, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and much more. You can sign up for a free trial today at klassiki.online. If you enjoy the show, don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, and remember you can always get in touch with us at podcast@klassiki.online. Russian documentary has been in the limelight recently, since the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature was awarded to Mr Nobody Against Putin earlier this year. Directed remotely by the American David Borenstein, the film consists of footage covertly shot by the Russian videographer Pasha Talankin inside the school where he worked, capturing how the militarisation and authoritarianism of the modern Russian state makes itself felt in the classroom. Mr Nobody raises questions about the ethical and logistical challenges of non-fiction filmmaking in wartime Russia and has been criticised by some, especially within Ukraine. But the focus on Borenstein's film risks overshadowing the rich and now at-risk tradition of documentary filmmaking inside Russia. In their new edited volume, The New Russian Documentary, Reclaiming Reality in the Age of Authoritarianism, the scholars Masha Shpolberg and Anastasia Kostina argue that in the face of growing repression, the 21st century has actually seen a boom in Russian non-fiction cinema, from new film schools and festivals to formal experimentation and theoretical debate, inspired by a desire for objectivity in the face of media manipulation from an increasingly coercive regime. This week, I welcomed Masha and Anastasia onto the pod to discuss the history and the function of documentary film in Putin's Russia. Masha Shpolberg is Assistant Professor of Film and Electronic Arts at Bard College, while Anastasia Kostina is a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University. Check out the volume that they've edited at the link in the show description, where you'll also find our own collection of contemporary Russian documentaries, available to Klassiki subscribers now. Masha and Anastasia, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Very, very glad to be here. Thanks, Sam. We're big fans of Klassiki and your work.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
To be here.
Very kind of you. Well, I'm really excited to get into this conversation because there is simply far too much to discuss. It's always the case, but with a book like yours and with a topic like this, you know, more than 2 decades worth of documentary filmmaking, it's particularly an issue today. So, yeah, let's just get straight into it. So, your book, this edited volume that you've put together, basically argues that, and this is my phrase, but I hope you won't disapprove, that we've recently come to the end of a kind of golden age of documentary filmmaking in Russia and in and about Russia. And I think for the casual listener, that might be quite surprising because people think of the Putinist era, which is what we're talking about, right, since the turn of the millennia, as this era of increasing censorship and authoritarianism and centralized cultural control, which is obviously all true. So, yeah, like why don't you both kind of introduce the premise behind this book and this idea of a kind of golden age of documentary film, despite of, or maybe even because of, what's been happening in Russia more broadly?
Thank you so much. It's a great question and a great way to put it. First, let me disagree. I wouldn't call it golden age, right? For me, more of a like renaissance, that is kind of reemergence. And we can talk about the historical tradition a bit later. But I wanted to start by thinking about how we arrived at the project, because I think this was like a very important part of it and partially an explanation or answer to your question. Because over the years, saying 2010s, late 2010s, I was presenting at conferences on this or that kind of contemporary documentary production or this or that documentary festival. It was clear to me and my colleagues who presented along on the same panels with me that there is something important happening within Russian documentary domain. And partially it was that I myself was a witness of this kind of important resurgence of documentary cinema, especially in 2010s. To give you just several examples, one of the major TV channels, Kultura, for example, in 2012, would invite documentary actors such as Marina Razbeshkina, Viktor Kosakovsky, Sergei Dvortsevoy to television program and kind of interview them about documentary cinema. On the other hand, we had the emergence of kind of documentary film festivals such as Ardok Fest, the creation of documentary film schools. So it was not just cinema as a medium, but it was also kind of a community, an active community of people interested in documentary. As for the question why, kind of this time and how this works with the increasing kind of media censorship, right, and the first two terms in Putin's Russia, I think one of the most important kind of premises of the book is that independent documentary cinema became this important space, for critical public discourse, the space where people could articulate views that would be, if not explicitly against, then at least kind of alternative to, official media narratives. Masha, do you want to add anything?
Sure. So first of all, maybe I'll just go back a little bit and say why specifically these years, 2000, 2022. So we chose these years because this is kind of the beginning of the Putin era, right? 2000 with Putin's election as president, and then 2022 with, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And as Anastasia said, the central argument, so the book, first of all, is called The New Russian Documentary, Reclaiming Reality in the Age of Authoritarianism. And the central premise is that documentary became one of the most important spaces for critical public discourse. Sam, exactly as you said, because in part, civic and political institutions were being progressively captured by the state. And so people were hungry. And I think there was a real need and a real desire for a place to get at reality, right? Or at some kind of more authentic sense of what was happening in the country. And the way that we decided to structure the volume, we really thought about the work that these films are doing. And we came up with kind of three rough tasks that they were accomplishing, which is that these are films that were contesting official narratives, films that were rethinking history, and cultivating civic consciousness under increasingly authoritarian conditions. And then what fascinated both of us, I think, are very interested in film form and aesthetics. And so I think very often in documentary circles, even in scholarly circles, people tend to focus on what the films are about. And we were really fascinated with, as Anastasia said, this resurgence of experimentation with film form. So these films were both interesting politically in terms of their subject matter and very formally experimental. And as Anastasia said, a big contention of the book is that the infrastructure was just as important as the films themselves.
Right.
And so by infrastructure, we mean all of these festivals, schools, places where people could meet and mingle and exchange opinions and ideas. And so that's where we came up with this idea of documentary really as a kind of alternative public sphere. And finally, a few more things I wanted to mention was that when we think about kind of the aesthetic, formal aspect of these films, I would say that it's very diverse. We can talk about all the different forms that it took. But I think in large part, they were really trying to be aesthetically and ideologically opposed to what was happening on state TV, which is that federal TV channels were increasingly producing a very standardized product. And so I think a lot of these documentaries were being experimental, different, diverse, like really to kind of counterbalance that in some part. I think that on the one hand, in the Russian media sphere, there's kind of state spectacle, like this official, totally sealed state spectacle. But then also in the 90s, there was a kind of postmodern cynicism that you encounter in books like Peter Pomerantsev, Nothing is Real and Everything is Possible.
Yeah.
And so I think kind of on an emotional level, we were really touched by these films, is that they were opposed to both of those ends of the spectrum, right? And so they were trying to oppose themselves both to the false propaganda image of reality and this kind of cynicism of you can't believe anything, nothing is real, by trying to cultivate a kind of sustained attention to ordinary life. And that really moved us, I think.
There's a lot to pick up on straight away there. But I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned infrastructure, because one of the things with thinking about film or studying or watching film is always how implicated it is in kind of political economies, simply because it is so expensive. It's quite hard to make a totally underground fiction feature film, for instance, because the resources involved are so extreme. But documentary non-fiction filmmaking is famously, or can famously be, I should say, a lot cheaper, a lot lighter, a lot more nimble on its feet. So in that sense, I guess it's not surprising, right, that it's this form that has exploded under Putin. And then I guess the other thing I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned, Anastasia, which is that this is actually a renaissance rather than a golden age, to play with our historical metaphors a little bit, because I think in the book you use the phrase "a rich history but poor infrastructure" to describe like where documentary was at the turn of the millennium. And right, this is the country, or the countries that basically helped to invent the idea of documentary cinema in the 20s. People like Dziga Vertov, SV Shub, and the Soviet Union also had its own very rich documentary tradition, which we probably don't have time to get into now, but which is to say that this is actually kind of a picking up on an earlier Soviet tradition or traditions, and a kind of reimagining those lessons in a different context.
So in the book, in addition to these kind of arguments that we propose, we also try to sketch out a kind of historical arc for how this documentary movement developed. And so for folks who might just be learning about it for the first time, we basically argue that it started in the 1990s as a trickle of films. Some of the most significant, or the ones that garnered the most attention, were the films by Viktor Kossakovsky and Sergei Dvortsevoy. So films like Belovy, Happiness or Счастье, and Bread Day, Хлебный день. And those films were in the style of kind of long-form observation, often of peasant life or life on the periphery, places where it seemed like nothing had changed. And one scholar has actually described it as a kind of forever always. And those films we really felt were in dialogue actually with the 1960s tradition of poetic documentary, or humanistic documentary also, so picking up there. And kind of like slow cinema, they were cultivating an attention to the present, a sensation of real-time passing. And again, we encountered to this kind of postmodern cynicism, right, of really like teaching us to look really carefully at what was happening. And where, for example, state TV was increasingly becoming focused on the past and reliving the glorious Soviet past, these were films that were really teaching us to be in the present. And then also in the 1990s, you get figures like Sergei Loznitsa and Vitaly Mansky, who become increasingly important as the decade goes on into the 2000s. And Loznitsa actually starts in the similar poetic documentary tradition with films like, my favorite is Palustanak, The Train Station, which is also in this kind of slow, long observational form. And then he moves into the films that he's become more well known for, which is the found footage kind of archival compilation films. And with Mansky, it's also essay films that use archival footage. And these really rely on, so these are interested in the past and looking back, but they rely on a kind of distinction between the context of production, like in the moment when these images were made, and how we read them very differently in the present. And then increasingly in the 2000s, with the creation of these film schools, with the creation of film festivals, and Mansky is a key figure here, with the creation of Art Doc Fest, you start getting many more figures. And again, this kind of formal experimentation, which Sam, as you pointed out, is so reminiscent of the 1920s. And if we really think about the 1920s moment, I think that what our period shares with the 1920s is this belief that nonfiction cinema is politically consequential, that it's really important. Experimentation with form and the idea that form can be political, attention to everyday life, and also the idea that cinema can reshape public consciousness. So there's a lot of connections to both the 20s and the 1960s. I'm sure Anastasia has more.
So what we see in the 90s with the trickle that Masha mentioned is this kind of regained interest in actual immediate reality. What kind of catalyzed this post-Soviet documentary was, of course, this kind of thirst for reality, representing it like as we can now. But also, of course, the digital moment, right? We cannot deny the role of the digital in production and creation of documentary cinema. And hence, the trickle of the 90s turns into almost like avalanche of 2000s. The idea that you can be like a one-person crew, filming, editing, producing, and kind of getting it out there by digital means as well, is revolutionary. And that's what kind of prompted a lot, not all of it, but definitely contributed.
Well, look, we should probably get into some of these films before we fall down too many historical rabbit holes, which is something I'm always prone to. I mean, you've already mentioned a couple of important names there: Vitaly Mansky, Sergei Lesnitsa, Marina Razbeshkina, Alexander Rastogoyev. These are all names which I hope we'll return to in the course of the conversation. In terms of a kind of breaking down this huge field, your approach in the book is to kind of subdivide by function, right? So, what kind of work the different films are doing, whether that's kind of addressing the political situation, whether that's engaging with Russia's history, or whether that's kind of advocating for particular vulnerable or marginalized groups or populations, right? So you've suggested to me very helpfully, I should say, a couple of kind of representative or symbolic films or directors which might kind of help us get into those kind of categories and those functions. So when it comes to films directly addressing kind of politics in Putin's Russia, the film you've suggested is a film called Immortal by a director, Ksenia Hapkina, which was made in 2019, and has a lot of echoes, as you point out, with Mr. Nobody Against Putin, this film that everyone's talking about at the moment. So I don't know which one of you wants to kind of introduce that film and what it tells us about kind of the political edge to contemporary documentary making.
Ksenia Hapkina's 2019, I think this was the reference that I suggested. Just because I get very, very upset every time people start talking to me about Mr. Nobody Against Putin when there's this other film. To give our audience kind of a more context, and I'm sure everyone who's listening to us has probably seen Mr. Nobody Against Putin, or at least knows what it is about, right? One director filming at his school where he worked as a teacher and organizer of events, and kind of over the course of one film showing how post 2022 the militarization or politicization of schools in Russia is unfolding. The Ksenia Hapkina's Immortal from 2019 is doing the exact same thing, only in completely different kind of stylistical terms. What we have there is this, I think already mentioned, kind of austere observational style. We do not get ironic or voice of God or any kind of voiceover. The footage, which is by no means accidental, but actually very well curated. But this is 2019, right? What is important for us to realize is that kind of the political developments in Russia were a very important part of documentary becoming this new force or alternative force. So by no means it starts in 2019. So it starts in 2011, 2012, right? When we have the largest civil uprising in Russia, people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets opposing the fraudulent parliamentary elections, right? And that's how maybe arguably the most famous and the most important political documentaries appear. And I'm talking about Winter Go Away by Razbeshkina school graduates. Right? So Ksenia Hapkina's Immortal is kind of following the same trend. Right? It's on the ground, quietly but very persuasively, showing us what is happening on the periphery. Something that we do not pay much attention to, but when we look at it closely, we're surprised how highly political kind of the context is.
Yeah, like you say, it's a film which, I was going to say echoes, but actually kind of prefigures a film like Mr. Nobody Against Putin in its subject matter, but prefigures it by several years and prefigures the full-scale invasion by several years. And you've mentioned there another film that I definitely wanted to get your thoughts on from another 7 years earlier. So that's 2012. So 10 years, a full 10 years before the full-scale invasion, which is this film Winter Go Away, which is a collective, it has no single director, it's a collectively made documentary. Like you say, it's about the protests of 2011, 2012, a key moment in kind of contemporary Russian history. And it's important because it documents that moment, but it's also important because it allows us to talk about this figure whose name has floated up a couple of times already, Marina Razbeshkina, and the Marina Razbeshkina school, literal school of documentary filmmaking. So I don't know, Masha, do you want to tell people who Marina Razbeshkina is? That's a big, weighty question.
Anastasia is the Marina Razbeshkina expert. And then I can chime in with some other thoughts when she's done.
Yeah, I think this will be me. Razbeshkina School, this is where I shine. I mean, we already touched on this kind of stories for reality, for capturing the immediate, the everyday, in the most authentic way possible. Authentic, of course, in kind of quotation marks. And Marina Razbeshkina was kind of the leading, Marina Razbeshkina School was the leading institution doing just that, in Russia of 2010s. So a little bit about Marina Razbeshkina herself. She was a filmmaker and documentary director who started making films in the late 80s. Very much kind of in response to this rigid documentary aesthetics of the Soviet times. She opted to work in this kind of very austere observational manner, but she gained a lot of prominence when she became an educator and she established her own school, Marina Razbeshkina and Mikhail Ugarov School of Documentary.
Yeah, I didn't mention Mikhail Ugarov. Sorry, Mikhail, but yes, it's in fact the Marina Razbeshkina and Mikhail Ugarov.
Yeah, I mean, it's also documentary film and theater.
Yes, that is also important.
Story, and we could write a whole podcast on documentary theater tradition in Russia. But let's go back to documentary cinema. So it's a very interesting institution. First of all, it's been named the largest independent documentary school in Russia, and I believe this is true. Over the course of their work from 2008 to 2020, they released over 200 graduates. Right? Many of them became important and prominent documentary filmmakers. What is different and especially interesting about the school and Marina Razbeshkina herself is that within kind of the bounds of the school, she teaches her student to work in this very austere, strict, observational manner.
Right, yeah.
Meaning that does not allow voiceover commentary, non-diegetic music, direct interviews. So the idea is that
she doesn't even allow tripods, right? You have to hold the camera yourself, yeah.
As less interference as possible. So the idea is that the filmmaker gets to their protagonist or protagonists as close as they can and kind of gather that material. Again, digital technology allows us to film for hours. The films of her graduates are characterized by this kind of extreme proximity to their subjects.
It's what she calls the zone of the snake, right? That's her famous phrase for where the filmmaker needs to kind of occupy.
That's a interesting story about that. I'm not going to go into details, but basically the zone of the snake is how close you can get to someone before they get alarmed.
Right.
But I think it was the mentioned Winter Go Away that actually brought the school into the limelight. They were already known in kind of documentary circles, but here they kind of became known to general public as well. So what happened is that with the mass protests that I mentioned earlier, Novaya Gazeta, which was the largest kind of oppositional newspaper in the country, they commissioned Razbeshkina students to create a documentary to document the protests. And so 10 of her graduates got together to film both important political figures, but also just common people kind of protesting, trying to do something. And they were filming for about 2 months in between kind of the most massive protests in December and to the election day in 2012. I don't remember off the top of my head, but those are like hours and hours of material, as you can imagine. So then the legend tells us that they locked themselves for a week or 2 weeks in one apartment, and they were editing 24/7, taking turns to come up with this very kind of intense but very well structured and kind of very comprehensive historical documentary account of the events, which came to be known as Winter Go Away.
And for me, one thing that, as I was thinking about our podcast, that really emerged out of all of this was the importance of editing. And I think this is also a 1920s connection, is that almost all of these modes of documentary, because in expository documentary, very often you will have a script beforehand. But here, very often you're dealing with hours and hours of footage. And so editing really occupies a primary role. And the director really becomes a director come editor who's thinking about how to structure the piece or the film, I guess, is being made largely in the editing room.
Yeah.
As pieces are coming together, and the argument of the film is very much in the editing rather than in a kind of expository voiceover.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about varieties of style or form, I mean, Marina Berezbeshkina has this very strict, austere, and famous formula or kind of demand in her school. But it's interesting. I mean, the school has produced so many documentary filmmakers, but also a lot of filmmakers who have kind of graduated from her school and gone on to become fiction filmmakers who've applied kind of a selective version of the Berezbeshkina style to fiction filmmaking, like Valeria Gaigermanica or Natalia Mashaninova, Oksana Bychkova. So yeah, I mean, even if you come from a very strict, particular kind of type of formal training, it doesn't necessarily kind of restrict the films that get made afterwards.
And I would say there was even a moment in the first half of the 2010s when you had a number of fiction films coming out by these graduates of the school that personally I really loved because of their grain of the real, even in the fiction films.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking here about Natalia Mesheninova's films in particular.
Well, that was all an extended riff on the idea of documentaries that are engaged in kind of the contemporary politics of the country. Another of the functions that you kind of cite or that you identify that documentary has been fulfilling in the last couple of decades is this attention to marginalized or peripheral or vulnerable groups within Russian society. And a figure who you wanted to highlight here, which I was very glad that you brought her up because I've been a fan of her works for a very long time, is Alina Rudnitskaya. And for her, the group in question is basically women. Her films tend to speak to the issues surrounding women in Russian society, speak to questions of kind of gender politics and gender violence, maybe. I mean, I hope it's come across, actually, we haven't really lent on it, but I hope it's come across so far in this conversation how many of the filmmakers involved in this documentary explosion have been women. It's something that lots of people have commented on. I guess the kind of low cost of entry and maybe the kind of political engagement of the medium has allowed for a large number of female filmmakers to emerge. So yeah, Alina Rudnitskaya, very interesting figure, who wants to jump in and explain why she's a representative figure and maybe which of her films you think are most useful.
I can start off with a few broad sentences, maybe just about this.
I love broad sentences.
Women documentary. So I just want to say that this is by no means unique to the Russian context. When we look historically or globally, right? Documentary has often been a place that has been more, in terms of like the political economy of cinema, has been more open to women, precisely as you say, Sam, because of lower budgets, people being more willing to let women in on the sphere.
I mean, going back to the 20s, right? S.V. Shub, one of the most...
Who Anastasia is writing a book on, yeah.
One of the most important figures in the history of nonfiction film.
who deserves to be as well known as Eisenstein or Vertov, but unfortunately often is mentioned third or fourth in these lists.
Well, that's a podcast for next season, Anastasia. You'll have to
Sure,
come back
sure.
in when you finished your book on her. But Alina Rudnitskaya.
She unfortunately represents, I think, everything that is right and wrong with women's documentary cinema in contemporary Russia, meaning that there's someone with an exceptional eye for documentary and with an exceptional talent, whose kind of documentary attempts are not supported by infrastructure, meaning
Right.
that she did release a handful of films, and my favorite by far is probably Blood and School of Seduction. It has to be said that she is mostly working also within kind of observational, but I would call it a different kind of observational cinema. So it's definitely not Razbeshkina style. In The School of Seduction, which follows kind of three heroines in contemporary Russia, each dealing with her own life and her own kind of gender struggles, we do get interviews and occasional monologues,
Yeah.
but still this kind of authenticity feel of observational is preserved. So Rudnitskaya, as a filmmaker, she's not intrusive. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, she had to quit documentary filmmaking. As far as I know, she was Czech Republic working for some media outlet, and she's no longer making films. So we can definitely see the trend within her work is dealing with gender dynamics in Russia, and mostly focusing on women and female heroines.
And one important thing to add about her also that I find so striking about her films is that there's such a lack of judgment. I mean, you see
Yeah.
her early short that put her on the map was called, you called it Bitch Academy or How to Be a Bitch. And it's basically observational footage from a school that women who are desperate to enter into relationships go to in order to learn how to attract and how to manipulate men. And so we see these lessons, some of which are incredibly touching, women breaking down in tears over their different complexes as they become aware of them. And some are very absurd. I mean, there's compilation footage of women doing things to bananas that we would rather not see. But what really strikes me in all of her films is a total lack of judgment and a kind of empathy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is a prerequisite for working in those kind of spaces and with that kind of subject matter. I mean, a film called Bitch Academy or How to Become a Bitch. It sounds like a slightly lurid reality TV show, but those kind of schools of seduction, as it were, those kind of schools for to turn women into pickup artists, strike me as a kind of the archetypical kind of post-Soviet Russian phenomenon. I know that kind of thing exists around the world, and pickup culture has become this kind of big phenomenon in the West as well. But yeah, that film, it's a short film, only half an hour, but it captures something really essential for me about the many crises, particularly as it regards gender in post-Soviet Russia.
And it's something that can often be the butt of a joke,
Right,
like we're
yeah.
so familiar with that as a kind of stereotype. And I think what she really does is she draws us in, I think, with our kind of lurid curiosity about what happens in these schools. But we come out of them with a kind of analytical framework for thinking about, oh, how are these women reacting to a context in which they have been disempowered, in which gender roles have become so traditional doesn't even seem the right word for it,
No.
right? Like so extreme, coming out of Soviet attempts at equality to total inequality between men and women, and to a kind of almost like armed conflict between the genders of some kind.
Yeah,
And
it's
I
like a
also wanted to say,
hyper-real version of gender. Go
oh,
on.
I also just wanted to say something really important, which is that because so many women were drawn to documentary filmmaking in this time period, and because women's issues were something that was like inherently discussed, there have been quite a few. I mean, Alina Rudnitskaya is not the only one. There's a
Sure,
whole
right, yeah.
plethora of names that we could name. I also wanted to say that this movement has been also attentive to LGBTQ issues,
Right,
but I wanted to
yes,
flag
yes.
that those films have been much harder to make because of censorship laws in Russia and because of the intense stigmatization of LGBTQ identity. And so I just wanted to highlight one film in our volume. We have an essay by Laura Maslenitsina about Children 404, which is a film
Yes,
about
yes.
LGBTQ identifying children speaking to camera. And you could not think of a more vulnerable population, right? On the one hand, these are children, and they're children with who identify as, as a doubly kind of vulnerable population. It's an incredibly touching film, and one that I also just really wanted to put onto the radar of anybody listening to this.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
guess who made this film? Razbeshkin school graduates.
There you go. I mean, we've been talking a lot about films that address the politics and the social issues of contemporary Russia. But one of the other kind of pillars of documentary making that you address in the book are documentaries that use the possibilities that the form allows to excavate Russian history. Mm-hmm. And that is as kind of politically important as films which are kind of directly about the politics of the day, because, as I'm sure many people are aware, one of the main things that the Putin regime has done has been to kind of weaponize the past, and continue to do so in very grotesque and criminal ways. So here maybe we can speak about a figure who will probably be much more familiar, at least by name, to listeners, and that is Sergei Loznitsa, who is not Russian. He would be very keen to point out, born in Belarus, raised in Ukrainian, identifies as a Ukrainian filmmaker. And people may be aware, right, of Loznitsa's archival documentaries, these where he puts together historical kind of nonfiction footage into these kind of collages that recreate a moment, often in Soviet history, in order to, like you said earlier, Masha, in order to kind of make us think about our relationship to the material and to the time period. And the film of his that you wanted to highlight in particular is his 2019 film State Funeral, which is about the funeral of Stalin in 1953. So yeah, I don't know which one of you wants to jump off on Loznitsa or this idea of kind of historical documentary.
Sure. I've followed Loznitsa's work for a while and find his work endlessly fascinating. I would say that he's a kind of polymath in that he has done so much. So he starts out in the 90s with these kinds of observational poetic documentaries. And then he develops at first both a fiction filmmaking arm of his work with films like My Joy, and increasingly starts working with archives. And he starts in the 2000s really mining the archives and producing, for me, one fascinating film after another. We chose to highlight this particular film because State Funeral basically is a collection of images that he has found documenting the death of Stalin all across the Soviet Union. And inherently, there's no way that you can't read it as a kind of reflection on authoritarian leadership and on Putin, right? Yeah. On the connection Putin himself has been cultivating between himself as a leader and Stalin. I think something that Loznitsa is always preoccupied with, several things, is using documentary to highlight how authoritarianism is sustained by everyday bureaucracy, and how it is so much a ritual that is performed daily, that there's a kind of daily performance that sustains all of these authoritarian regimes. I just wanted to say that the reason these films are so important, on the one hand, it might seem like they're just kind of looking back historically, but these are films that are very much also, I think, encouraging everybody to start thinking about films that are shot today as a kind of archive in the making. And I think if, our book is in large part kind of a sad book, right? We say it's a movement that has ended, it's a movement that is over. But if there is a hopeful kind of line there, is that a lot of these films or a lot of these practices are already imagining a kind of end of Putin and a looking back on the Putin era retrospectively. And I find a lot of hope in that, the fact that we can imagine this kind of end.
Well, one problem I have with Loznitsa's tactics, especially with found footage, is of course that it takes a very educated and already kind of very conscious viewer, to get the message, to appreciate the film. And if we think about people coming with lack of, historical cultural context or lack of education in this particular domain, and I'm thinking, younger generation, then it takes more than kind of found footage to reevaluate the history for them.
And, it's kind of a world away from the seriousness of Loznitsa, but Another figure who I think it would be important to mention, and a kind of area of nonfiction filmmaking that it's important to mention that usually falls by the wayside for cinephiles, and an important figure when it comes to this question of broadening or questioning perspectives on history, is I'm going to use this slightly derogatory term, YouTuber, Yuri Dud, who's really interesting figure, not really to my taste personally, but like a very interesting and I'd argue important figure on the contemporary Russian internet and contemporary Russian viewing, if you like. So, I mean, who wants to give us a quick rundown on the work of Yuri Dud?
Sure, I contributed the essay on Dudes to our volume. So Dude started off very much in the world of journalism. He was a sports journalist initially. And then in 2017, that's really the year that not only Dudes, but a lot of other Russian figures turned to YouTube as a kind of platform to begin reaching wider audiences. And so Dudes became kind of one of the first early stars of what became an increasingly popular interview format on Russian YouTube. So in addition to him, there's Ksenia Sobchak, there's many others that we could name, who all, for the most part, do these kinds of interviews with celebrities and public-facing figures. And Dude started out initially interviewing pop figures, rappers, models, and then all of a sudden, within about 2 years, but then increasingly, very quickly, he started bringing in public intellectuals to interview on his YouTube channel. And the film that really established him as more of a filmmaker, kind of, was a film about Kolyma, a film about the Gulag system. And that film, overnight after he released it, was viewed by millions of people. I think at present it's had 20 million views. And Dudes himself, his channel, I checked the morning that we were recording, he has about 10 million subscribers on YouTube. And in a way, he's almost like the counter Laznitsa, right? So if Anastasia's kind of problem with Laznitsa is that Laznitsa is very much highbrow. He's there for the people who know the historical context. Dude is much more explicit. And the reason that I personally actually don't mind Dude so much, my essay is very positive towards him, is that I think he's accomplishing a really important civic role in educating a younger generation. So he himself says that he was inspired to make Kolyma because something like 80% of Russian students aged like 18 to 25 hadn't heard of the Gulag system. And so he was really shocked by this and he wanted to rectify the situation. And his filmmaking style is really no experts. And then he himself is very kind of non-traditional, informal. And so what he is trying to do is very often to take subjects that were taboo or subjects that are really heavy, to destigmatize them and to modernize and popularize them for a youth audience.
Well, I think it would be good in closing to kind of bring us up to date and to think about what has happened in the last couple of years. I mean, obviously the full-scale invasion in 2022 is a event horizon, if you like, but that conflict didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014. While the situation has got much, much worse in Russia since 2022, it's an acceleration, right? It's not a new event that's occurred. To wit, like I'm thinking about a figure who we've mentioned a couple of times, we haven't gone into detail on, like Alexander Rastogoyev, a really interesting filmmaker who was really kind of tragically killed in 2018 in the Central African Republic while he was making a film about the Wagner Group and their work in Africa. And I think at the time, I mean, I know I was much more dimly aware of what the Wagner Group was at the time. Now, of course, we're all very sadly aware of who they are and what they represent. So, yeah, like if you could help bring us up to date and kind of maybe give us a brief overview of what the situation since 2022 is for Russian documentary filmmakers. I presume that most of the valuable work is being done from abroad.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Alexander Rastorguyev, Sam. Thank you. He was a beloved figure in the documentary filmmaking scene. He's actually really interesting. So one important thing about this movement is also that so much of it re-energized the provinces. There's a tendency, Russia is often seen as a very centralized culture with everything happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And Rastorguyev came from Rostov-na-Donu, so from the south of Russia. And a lot of these festivals, by the way, that we've been describing, and even some of the schools have been not in the centers. They've been not in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this energy, I would say, has really been kind of nodal around Russia and has really energized the periphery. Rastorguyev was probably the most experimental of the filmmakers we cover in the book. He very much believed that the subjects of the films should also be the co-creators of the films. So he had practices where he would, for example, hand out camcorders to teenagers and young people in Rostov and ask them to film themselves. And then his primary kind of contribution as a director would be to edit it. He often worked in tandem with another filmmaker, Pavel Kostomarov, together on a number of projects. And so he really modeled a kind of collaborative process, and I think a really high respect for his subjects. And he was thinking very hard. In documentary, there's often a lot of debates about how to make films that don't feel extractive, because very often a filmmaker will parachute in, make a film, and then exit somebody's life. And almost always the subject is in a kind of vulnerable position. And so Rastorguyev was somebody who was thinking very, very hard about how to make films in a non-extractive way.
Right. And yeah, like I say, he was killed whilst working on this film on the Wagner Group, which brings us kind of full circle, if you like, to the present day.
Well, Russian documentary post 2022. As we know, kind of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was followed in Russia almost immediately by a series of very oppressive media regulations, which essentially put an end to any kind of independent political filmmaking. Right? Films continue to be made, of course, and Russian film festivals do not have shortage in submissions. But as we can imagine, most of these films are, if not completely apolitical, then at least kind of ideologically safe. Although I'm still hopeful, and I feel like if you look for it, you can find subtext even in those so-called neutral films. So long story short, those who want to make explicitly political films, they're now outside of Russia.
Can I just chime in a little bit? So as I said, I'm from Ukraine, and I'm very interested also in attempts that there have been on the Russian side to talk about the war in Ukraine. And so I wanted to point out that even before the full-scale invasion, there was a small number of films or filmmakers who were brave enough to actually try to document the conflict. And one film that Anastasia has actually written and presented a lot about that really blew me away is Beata Bubinets's Flight of a Bullet, Полет пули, which is an hour and 20 minutes, and it's a single take. So Beata Bubinets is a Russian woman director who managed to ingratiate herself with a volunteer battalion in the east of Ukraine, a Ukrainian battalion. And so she follows them. She stayed with them, actually lived with them for several weeks. And the film is 1 hour and 20 minutes in her life with this battalion. And it's absolutely fascinating as this kind of single shot movie. And so I just want to say that there were attempts prior to 2022. Anastasia has a correction to make.
No, and do I need to tell you that Beata Bubinets came out of Marina Razbyashkin's school?
Sure. But that's really a fascinating film. And then maybe post 2022, just to summarize things really briefly, the logistical challenges I think a lot of us can imagine, right? It's the intensification of censorship. It's highly intense criminal repercussions for anybody who attempts to speak out in any way. And of course, a lack of funding. I always find it fascinating that filmmakers like Zvyagintsev, in the past were able to take federal government money and then make films that were so kind of, anti-Putin's Russia in spirit. I think the Zvyagintsev phenomenon is no more. I think filmmakers would be too scared to try to do that now. And then, of course, for the filmmakers who have left, the challenge is access to people on the ground and, of course, funding. But for me as a Ukrainian, I think the ethical questions are also equally important. And so the ethical questions that come to mind is, can one ethically portray ordinary life, in Russia? You could take an ethical stance there. Another problem that I think a lot of Ukrainians have also had with Mr. Nobody Against Putin is, does focusing on Russian suffering risk relativizing Ukrainian suffering, right? And how do filmmakers try to negotiate? I think that's probably one of the hardest things for Russian filmmakers to negotiate at present. And this might be a good transition to Mr. Nobody Against Putin, which I personally had a lot of mixed feelings about. And I think that my take of that film was that it's not for people. This isn't my take. I should say that the critic Anton Dolin has said that it's not a film for people well familiar with the situation. It's really a film for people who are not that familiar with the situation on the ground, that introduces people to some of the realities there. And thinking of it in that way, I was very grateful to Pavel Talankin for his courage to make the film. What I found to be incredibly moving, actually, is there's a scene towards the film tries to maintain a lighthearted note throughout, and then gets darker and darker towards the end. And there's a moment when Talankin says that he didn't want to record visually the funeral of a friend who had died while performing military service in Ukraine, so he just recorded the sound. And we hear the soldier's mother just screaming his name in a voice of utter despair. Anastasia and I are both mothers, and I think purely as a mother, I just started crying in that moment. And everything in me was so conflicted because as somebody from Ukraine, so many of my friends and colleagues, et cetera, are also on the front. And here I am crying for a Russian soldier. And to me, that was really powerful in that film, despite many other things that we might criticize it for. So I would say that I think that's the biggest challenge, is this kind of how do we humanize the toll of the war for the Russian side, while not losing sight of the extreme suffering for Ukrainians.
Well, obviously it's the situation is extremely grave. Obviously, the situation is graver in Ukraine, but it's a situation that filmmakers in Ukraine and in Russia and throughout the region are continuing to have to adapt to, and we'll see how that evolves in the coming years. But I think we'll leave it there for now today. Masha Shpolberg, Anastasia Kostina, thank you so much for your book and for joining me today and for talking through this renaissance in Russian documentary filmmaking.
Thank you for having us. It was a pleasure.